When I got into self improvement and I've started reading books, the only books that I've even considered reading were the self improvement, self help, kind of the practical advice ones. And I've read those books for for almost a year straight. Like the first year on self improvement that I had, I've pretty much read the just self help, self improvement books because I was railing pretty hardly against any classical fiction books because you technically you cannot get practical advice from them, and hence why they'll not help you to develop yourself. But then I've started just taking a little bit more interest in classical books. And at first I just started reading short stories from the Russian author Anton Chekhov. And then this is the book that changed my whole reading life. I bought the book 1984 by George Orwell. And this book has absolutely changed my reading life because from there on, I've started kind of integrating classical books into my reading list. And at first it was 90-10, so 90% of my books would be self-help, self-improvement, practical advice ones. But then slowly and slowly, I've actually started integrating more classical books to the point where I think the division right now would be 50-50, or maybe even 60-40 for me. I read right now mostly classical fiction books. I still read self-improvement books, but it's just I got much more into classical fiction. And here's the thing. Yesterday, I've recorded a video about why reading books on social skills is it's just kind of useless, and I totally agree with the thing is with social skills, you must go out and actually experience life instead of just sitting at home and reading books on social skills. It's social skills is perhaps the only domain in this kind of self improvement space that I would say yeah, man, reading books is not that of course there are some books that you can read, and reading a book on social skills, it won't harm you in any way, so that's not a an advice for you to never read books on social skills. Of course it's not, but it's the 80-20 is just going out and experiencing life. But the general advice when it comes to reading books on self-improvement, it is just, man, it is awful. It is absolutely awful because the self improvement space, it is divided into what I seen. It is divided into two camps. So the first camp is railing against reading books like their life depends on it, because they're saying that the first camp is saying that you must get experience from real life. This reading books is absolutely useless, and I have a video on my channel which I recorded half a year ago where I criticized that advice. And of course that's bullshit. It's yeah, I would agree if the topic would be social skills, for example, but in any other domain like money, I don't know, general advice in basically any sort of domain in life, reading books is essential. It is absolutely essential. But the second camp is that I fell into this camp when I just got on self improvement, and it's that you should only read self help, self improvement. You should never read fiction or classics because you cannot get practical advice from them, and that's completely bullshit. Because here's the thing: the knowledge that you get from the books, from the classical books, it is completely different from what you'll get in the practical advice ones. Because why I say practical advice, because they are practical advice. You open up a self-improvement book and you get advice in terms of do this, make sure you do that, change this. So you get like a perfectly, like you get an idea of what you should change, of how you should change it, when you should change it. Like you just get this like practical advice on doing things, and that's why self-improvement books exist. But the knowledge you get from classical fiction, it is much more subtle. It is much more unpractical. I would say it's more philosophical to some degree because, for example, currently I'm reading The Brothers Karamazovs by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this book in itself, it is a, it is, there's a case to be made that this is the greatest book ever written, like period. It's like not, it is not the greatest like Russian book ever written. It is not the greatest novel ever written. It is like perhaps the best book ever written, and like the best book is it is, man. It's a pretty big domain, I would say. But the knowledge that, and I've read like half of the book right now. I'm like a little bit. I have read a little bit more than a half, and this book is massive. It's like my copy has almost 1,000 pages. The knowledge that I've got so far from this book is very different from the knowledge that I will get, for example, from reading like another self-improvement book, because this is it's a more of like a philosophical wisdom that you get from those books, and the wisdom there, how do you even explain it? I once watched I once listened to a podcast with Jordan Peterson. I think it was Lex Freeman who interviewed him. And Peterson, he said one very interesting thing about Dostoevsky. And this is, I would say it applies not only to Dostoevsky, it applies to basically to any classical literature. He basically compared Dostoevsky to the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And what Peterson said is that Dostoevsky, he's deeper. He's much deeper because like Nietzsche, he's a philosopher. He has to explain his philosophy in terms. And Dostoevsky can just write it out in like his characters' thoughts and actions. And that's this kind of way of writing it out. It allows you to explain the thoughts much more expressively. See what I mean? This is why reading classical books is so powerful. It's like you get the thoughts and ideas and the knowledge, and maybe sometimes even practical advice. Like I would say to like from some classical books I've got like a very practical advice. It is not like do this or that. Like here's like I don't know how much protein you need to take to in order to like gain muscle. It's like no, you don't get that advice. You gain. It is more of like a even to some degree spiritual advice that you get, especially from the Brothers Karamazov, certainly. But this is generally what I see. The knowledge is very different, and thinking that you can live your life without reading those books, it is absolutely stupid. But now look, here's the thing. I would probably guess that you are just like a normal guy who's on self-improvement, who's just like consuming content, who's watching like, I don't know, self-improvement videos, and maybe sometimes he opens up a book sometimes. So the question is, it's like what to read from like classics. Because I'm not going to be like that guy from all of those like dopamine videos who's going to tell you the exact list of like, because look man, I haven't read a lot of classical books. I haven't read it like a lot. I have read much more of like the self-improvement, self-help ones. And my advice would be with like what books to read would be a little bit different from all of those guys from like, as I said, from dopamine videos. Because as I said, right now I'm reading The Brothers Karamazovs, and this is the book that I would never recommend for anybody to read as their like first book, especially for like an introduction to Dostoevsky, because I have read Dostoevsky before, and more of not so like his his five essential novels like The Demons, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Notes from the Underground. I think, yeah, I said them all. But I have read more of like them Dostoevsky, which nobody really knows about, and or nobody really speaks about. And the thing is, with Dostoevsky, I wouldn't recommend him to read as like your first classical book. It's certainly after you have like read a couple of books, man, Dostoevsky is the order that you need to choose because this is, and you probably I don't even need to explain to you the genius of Fyodor Dostoevsky. But the book that I would recommend to you to read as your first classical book is going to be the exact one that I have started, and it is 1984 by George Orwell. Because, look, man, this book, first of all, of course, it is a dystopia. Dystopian books are always like, quite, I wouldn't say quite easy, but kind of in this not in the sense of like, how would you even explain it? First of all, 1984, of course, it's like, I wouldn't say it's a fun read, no, not at all. It's like, it's not a fun book. But it's very interesting to read because Orwell has written in that way that it keeps you kind of like in a little bit of like a terror whilst you're reading it. And like, when you can make somebody like feel this terror through like text, man, that is a good book. And the second thing is like, it is not that philosophically profound as, for example, Dostoevsky, who I'm reading right now. But it's also like, it's a very different kind of philosophy that Orwell is trying to explain to you because it's kind of like to some degree, it's like not to some degree, it's like a political philosophy. It's like there's no to some degree, it's like a purely political philosophy which he's trying to explain to you, and sometimes it's more like a how would you even call it, everyday philosophy on how to like live in a totalitarian state, because you probably know what the book is about, because this book is like, it's one of the most popular books ever written. And so I will recommend to you 1984 by George Orwell. Certainly I have never regretted starting my sort of like classical fiction journey from this book. Which books I will recommend also? I would say to some degree, I would say Fathers and Sons by the Russian author Ivan Turgenev. It is really the one. It is the book that I liked very much. Our books that I have read, I would just say, like, they're good, but you either need to know like too much context whilst you're reading them, or they're just like not for the starts. It's like they're pretty tough to read because I would say the two books that are kind of like accessible for the guys who are just starting out, I would say, yeah, Oral and Fathers and Sons by Turgenev. This the latter one is an absolute great masterpiece of analyzing the nihilistic philosophy itself, which is kind of like, yeah, man, it's an interesting topic. And let me plug in something right here. If you really want to maximize as a man, if you really want to become that superior version of yourself, I offer coaching. I have been on self-improvement for 1.5 years right now, and I have learned a lot of lessons which I can teach you for you to shortcut basically the adversaries that you need to go through. And so if you want to get coaching from me, my email is linked down below. And with that being said, I hope this will help you, and see you in the next one.